Thank you, Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both of you for being here. I was trying to take notes, but I think I got this right, Mr. Peterson, that you talked about this bill as being an expression of the vanguard of ideology. Am I right in thinking?
Well, I was thinking more about the policies that surrounded it, but
Okay.
yes.
Yeah. So I'm trying to square what you, as a party of one, are saying with published documents from the Canadian Psychological Association, the American Psychological Association, the Canadian Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the United Nations human rights experts. So these are all, these are not parties of one. They are associated. They are all, I imagine, lots of psychologists are members of the Canadian Psychology Association and the Canadian Psychiatry. So how are we to square what you're saying, which is your opinion, which you are absolutely entitled to, with what everyone is saying, plus the feelings and testimonies of the people who have suffered over 30 years, who've been taking issues to court? These are people who we've listened to. So how are we to square this?
Okay, well, with regards to your second point, if the people that you're listening to aren't randomly selected from a population, then their opinions are worthless from the perspective of testimony, because you don't know if you're dealing with a biased sample. And that's a big problem with the public consultation process that underlied this bill. And you can not appreciate that if you'd like, but it's standard practice in any polling institution or any body that's attempting to extract a genuine opinion out of a so-called community of people. And if that isn't followed, then you can't tell if the information that you're receiving is biased. And this, with regards to your first point, what exactly are all those people who aren't thinking the same way as me saying? You said that there's a bunch of them and a bunch of groups, but you never said what they're saying precisely.
Well, I think our chair would rule me out of order if I proceed.
No, you're fine.
To read out what they're all saying. But in general, they say they oppose discrimination and harassment because of gender identity and gender expression. And then there's 3 pages, which I can share with you.
I oppose discrimination against gender identity and gender expression. That's not the point. The point is the specifics of the legislation that surrounds it and the insistence that people will have to use compelled speech. That's what I'm objecting to. I've dealt with all sorts of people in my life, people who don't fit in all sorts of different ways. I'm not a discriminatory person. There's 500 hours of my teaching to my classrooms on tape on YouTube, and nobody's found a smoking pistol. I'm not a discriminatory individual, but I think this legislation is reprehensible, and I do not believe for a moment that it will do what it intends to do. I also don't think that my opinion deviates substantially from the bodies that you're describing, because you haven't provided any evidence that they say anything other than discrimination is a bad thing. And I think that unreasonable discrimination is a bad thing. And it's unreasonable when people are judged for any reason other than the specific competence that they bring to, say, a given position. It's not in anyone's best interest that that occurs. But I don't think that you've demonstrated in the least that the opinions that I'm putting forward exist in opposition to the standard practices, say, of my particular discipline. So,
May I follow? Mm-hmm. Could you repeat one more time your response to Senators Gold and Pratt that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has provided what I would say reasonable alternatives to your objection to using pronouns?
well, I think it's been made clear in the presentation so far is that it depends on which part of the Ontario Human Rights Commission's policies you read. And that's a big problem. I mean, that's one of the reasons I criticized this to begin with, was because when I went through the policies, I could see that they're absolutely incoherent. So, for example, here, let me give you another example. So there's an insistence in the Ontario Human Rights Commission that sexual preference is an immutable phenomena, which indicates, at least in principle, that it's biologically grounded. But by the same token, in exactly the same policies, they presume that sexual identity, and gender expression are entirely independent. It's like, sorry, guys, you can't have both of those because one's A and one's not A, and you can't put those together. And like, there's endless numbers of places in the policy surrounding Bill C-16 that are characterized by that kind of logical incoherency. And I mean, what's it going to do to people who are transgender, who are making the claim that they were, say, born that way at birth, which is a strong claim. That's a biological claim. It indicates that there's a direct causal connection between some biological phenomena and the expression of a particular identity. It's actually the strongest defense that people who have, let's call them non-standard sexual identities or gender identities, have to defend their claims.
I have to wrap it up there and move on to Senator Boisvert.
First of all, Dr. Peterson, I want to go back to this issue of personal pronouns, and if you could please tell our committee more about this issue. It's something that I was not at all familiar with prior to this bill being introduced, and in particular about the gender-neutral pronouns and your experience in pushing back against being forced to use those gender-neutral pronouns.
Well, I don't think the people who initiated this legislation ever expected that there would be an absolute explosion of identities, first of all, and also of so-called personal pronouns, as there has been. I think Facebook now recognizes something like 71 separate gender identity categories, each of which in principle is associated with its own set of pronouns. And so it's become, well, linguistically, it's become a parody, essentially. It's become linguistically unmanageable. And it's also the case that words can't be introduced into the language by fiat. I can't even think of a time when that's actually worked. We're not exactly sure how words enter the common parlance, but it's certainly not that way. And so the legislation devolves into a kind of absurdity, as far as I can tell. I mean, one of the people that I discussed this with claimed that the way that you kept track of someone's personal pronouns was to use your cell phone as an adjunct to your communication. And I mean, you wouldn't say anything like that if you knew anything about common human nature, let's say, and the manner in which people communicate with one another.
Okay, so the types of pronouns you're talking about, just so everyone's clear, because I don't think these are common parlance, Z and Zer, and what other sorts of gender-neutral pronouns are we discussing here?
Well, I have a very bad memory for that sort of thing, but if you're interested in it, you can find lists of them very rapidly on the web, and they've been produced by, I think, they've been produced by people whose essential desire is to gain linguistic control. That's as simply as I can put it, is to gain linguistic control. But they're not used popularly. And that seems to me to be it's a real problem as a consequence, that you make failure to make their use something that could carry a criminal penalty. So I just don't understand that. And I don't understand how the government can justify imposing a criminal penalty on the use of words that no one either knows or uses. It just seems preposterous to me. But there it is.
Could you please also tell us a little bit more about your personal experience in pushing back against this? And I mean, many are familiar with your story, but not everyone, so I just want to give you a little bit
Well,
of
I made a
opportunity to talk
video,
about that.
actually I made 3 videos, but we'll just talk about one of them. I made one criticizing Bill C-16 for the reasons that I already described, because I went and read the policies, and they made my hair stand on end to the surrounding policies. And so I made a video stating essentially that and detailed out my reasons. And you know, I've been following the battle of, let's say, ideologies on campus for a very long period of time, and I suppose I have some expertise in that. And there's an ideological war that's ripping the campuses apart, and it's essentially between an ideological variant that's rooted in what's come to be known as postmodernism, with kind of a neo-Marxist base, and modernism, I would say. And that's accounting for all the turmoil on the campuses, and I see this as an extension of this campus turmoil into the broader world, and I really believe that is the proper level of analysis. I truly believe that. And so I said that I believe that this is a vanguard issue in a kind of ideological war, and that I'm not going to participate on the side of the people whose ideological stance I find reprehensible, unforgivable and reprehensible, especially the Marxist element of it. And so I announced that I wasn't going to use these words because I don't believe that they're instantiated to protect anyone's rights. I believe that the ideologues who are pushing this movement are using unsuspecting and sometimes complicit members of the so-called transgender community to push their ideological vanguard forward, and I firmly believe that. So I'm not participating in that. And the fact that it's potentially illegal for me not to participate in that is something that I regard as, I think that's absolutely dreadful. It puts a shudder in my heart as a Canadian that we could even possibly be in a situation like that. You know, if if the identity claims that are instantiated in this in the policy surrounding this legislation are applied, it's going to be hell for the psychiatrists, excuse my language. It's going to be very difficult for the biologists and the psychiatrists next. And I think we'll see that happening very soon. I think that the definition of identity that's enshrined in the surrounding policies is ill-defined and poorly thought through and also incorrect. It's incorrect in that identity is not and will never be something that people define subjectively, because your identity is something that you actually have to act out in the world as a set of procedural tools, which most people learn, and I'm being technical about this, between the ages of 2 and 4. It's a fundamental human reality. It's well recognized by the relevant, say, developmental psychological authorities. And so the idea that identity is something that you define purely subjectively is an idea without status as far as I'm concerned. I also think it's unbelievably dangerous for us to move towards representing a social constructionist view of identity in our legal system. The social constructionist view insists that human identity is nothing but a consequence of socialization, and there's an inordinate amount of scientific evidence suggesting that that happens to not be the case. And so the reason that this is being instantiated into law is because the people who are promoting that sort of perspective, or at least in part because the people who are promoting that sort of perspective know perfectly well that they've lost the battle completely on scientific grounds. It's implicit in the policies of the Ontario Human Rights Commission that sexual identity, biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual proclivity all vary independently, and that's simply not the case. It's not the case scientifically, it's not the case factually, and it's certainly not something that should be increasingly taught to people in high schools, elementary schools, and junior high schools, which it is, and it is being taught. I included this cartoon character that I find particularly reprehensible, aimed obviously at it as it is at children somewhere around the age of 7, that contains within it the implicit claims, as a consequence of its graphic mode of expression, that these elements of identity are first canonical and second independent, and neither of those happen to be the case. I think that the inclusion of gender expression in the bill is something extraordinarily peculiar, given that gender expression is not a group, and that, according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, it deals with things as mundane as how behavior and outward appearance such as dress, hair, makeup, body language, and voice, which now, as far as I can tell, open people to charges of hate crime under Bill C-16 if they dare to criticize the manner of someone's dress, which seems to me to be an entirely voluntary issue. So I think that the Ontario Human Rights Commission's attitude towards vicarious liability is designed specifically to be punitive, in that it makes employers responsible for harassment or discrimination, including the failure to use preferred pronouns. They have vicarious liability for that, whether or not they know it's happening, whether or not the harassment was